The winter of 1884 settled over Berlin like a heavy gray shroud. The streets were muffled in snow. Smoke from coal fires clung low in the air. Inside a stately building on Wilhelmstrasse, the heart of the German capital, candlelight flickered against tall mahogany panels. The air was thick. The sharp tang of cigar smoke mingled with the scent of polished wood and damp wool coats. A long table gleamed under gaslight. On it lay great sheets of parchment, detailed maps of Africa, hand-colored, its coasts traced with precision, but its vast interior still marked with blank spaces or vague sketches. Men in tailored coats leaned over them, their breath misting in the cold air. They spoke in clipped German, French, English, Portuguese, and Italian, the languages of empires. In the room were some of the most powerful men of Europe. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, presided over the gathering. His steel-gray eyes scanned the table like a military map. Beside him, King Leopold II of Belgium, tall and imposing, wearing his heavy beard like a badge of authority. The British delegates, representing a global empire on which the sun famously never set. The French, eager to expand their claims from Algeria deep into the Sahara. The Portuguese, clinging to centuries-old coastal holdings. The Italians, late to empire but ambitious. And others, 14 nations in total. But there was one glaring absence. Not a single African leader sat at the table. No voice from the kingdoms of the Ashanti, the Zulu, the Buganda, or the Sokoto Caliphate. No delegate from the Congo Basin or the West African coast. The fate of an entire continent was being decided without its people. The date was November 15th, 1884. The place, Berlin. The occasion, what history would call the Berlin Conference, a diplomatic gathering that would reshape Africa forever. Officially, its purpose was to regulate European trade and colonization in Africa, to prevent conflicts among the imperial powers. But beneath the polite speeches and legal documents lay motives far less noble. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade earlier in the century had not ended European exploitation of Africa. It had merely transformed it. The old trade in human lives was replaced by what was called legitimate commerce. Palm oil to grease the gears of Europe's factories. Ivory for piano keys and billiard balls. Gold to mint coins. And rubber to feed the growing appetite of the Industrial Revolution. Africa's natural wealth was the new prize, and the Berlin Conference was where the rules for taking it would be written. Bismarck, who until then had shown little interest in overseas colonies, hosted the conference with calculated purpose. Germany wanted recognition as a global power, and Bismarck understood that a seat at the table of Africa's division would cement his nation's status. He positioned himself as a neutral mediator, but every move was strategic. In the weeks before the conference, private letters passed between capitals. Leopold II's agents were especially active. For years, he had been sending explorers like Henry Morton Stanley deep into the Congo Basin under the guise of humanitarian and scientific work. Leopold spoke passionately of ending Arab slave raids and bringing Christianity to the heart of Africa. But his real goal was to carve out a vast personal empire, not for Belgium, but for himself. Through a web of deceptive treaties with local chiefs, often signed under duress or without understanding, Leopold's International Association of the Congo laid claim to millions of square kilometers. The Berlin Conference would legitimize those claims. The first dramatic twist came early. Many assumed Britain and France, the two great colonial rivals, would oppose each other's ambitions. But behind closed doors, they struck quiet understandings. France would not block British control over the Lower Nile. Britain would not contest French claims in parts of West Africa. Other secret deals emerged in the shadows. Germany and Portugal discussed the so-called Pink Map, an ambitious Portuguese claim linking Angola on the Atlantic coast to Mozambique on the Indian coast. It would fail in the long run, but it showed how brazenly Europe was redrawing Africa to suit its own ambitions. For over 3 months, from November 1884 to February 26, 1885, the delegates debated, drafted, and signed agreements. They adopted the General Act of the Berlin Conference, which declared that any European power claiming territory in Africa must establish effective occupation, meaning they had to actually administer and police the area, not just plant a flag. In paper, it was meant to prevent hollow claims. In reality, it triggered a frantic scramble. The Congo Basin became a central focus. By the conference's end, Leopold II had secured international recognition for his Congo Free State, a territory over 80 times the size of Belgium, to be ruled as his private property. What was presented as a humanitarian victory would, in time, become one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history, with forced labor, mass killings, and the ruthless extraction of ivory and rubber. Other African regions were quietly assigned like squares on a chessboard. Britain tightened its grip on the Gold Coast and Nigeria. France expanded its reach in modern-day Senegal, Guinea, and the Ivory Coast. Germany claimed Togoland, Cameroon, and German Southwest Africa. Portugal clung to Angola and Mozambique. Italy eyed Eritrea and Somalia. The delegates spoke of bringing civilization and progress, but Africa's economic value was never far from their lips. The continent was rich in gold from the Ashanti lands, copper from Katanga, diamonds from South Africa, and fertile lands for cash crops like cocoa and cotton. European industrialists saw in Africa's rivers and forests a vast reservoir of untapped profit. Another hidden truth was the role of missionary societies. European powers often used missionaries as the first wave of penetration to establish schools, churches, and medical posts. While many missionaries sincerely sought to improve lives, their presence also paved the way for political control, softening resistance and providing intelligence to colonial authorities. The civilizing mission narrative masked the extraction of resources and the dismantling of African political systems. Even before the ink dried on the General Act, resistance was stirring. In West Africa, the Ashanti fought a series of wars against British encroachment. In the south, the Zulu kingdom, under leaders like Cetshwayo and later Dinuzulu, resisted British and Boer encroachment. In the Horn, the Ethiopian Empire under Menelik II maneuvered diplomatically to maintain its sovereignty, culminating in the stunning defeat of an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Yet the Berlin Conference's legacy was already set. By drawing straight lines across maps, often along lines of latitude and longitude, the Europeans ignored Africa's existing ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. Communities that had traded, intermarried or shared governance for centuries were suddenly divided by invisible borders. Others were forced together under single administrations, sowing tensions that would erupt long after independence. Perhaps the greatest irony was that the conference claimed to promote free trade in Africa. In truth, it legalized monopolies for the colonial powers and locked African economies into dependence on Europe. Railways were built not to connect African communities, but to move resources from mines and plantations to the nearest port for export. By February 26, 1885, when the final signatures were inked in, the framework for the Scramble for Africa was complete. In the next 3 decades, European control of African territory would leap from roughly 10% to over 90%. Only Liberia and Ethiopia would remain formally independent, though both faced immense external pressure.
The Berlin Conference was not a single theft, it was the opening of a vault. The gold, ivory, palm oil, rubber, and countless other resources taken from Africa in the years that followed helped build Europe's industrial might. Grand boulevards, factories, and even the cultural monuments of European capitals were financed, in part, by wealth extracted from African soil. But Africa paid the price. Forced labor systems broke communities. New borders undermined centuries-old political orders. Famines and population declines followed in the wake of colonial policies that prioritized export crops over local food needs. And the myth of European benevolence, the idea that colonization was a gift of civilization, endured for generations. Today, you can still trace the outlines of those Berlin maps in the political map of Africa. Borders drawn in smoke-filled rooms in Berlin now define the nations of a continent. The economic systems established in those years still influence trade patterns and development challenges. And the archives, the private letters, the unpublicized agreements, still hold secrets about what was promised, traded, and betrayed behind closed doors. What is certain is that the Berlin Conference was less about preventing conflict among Europeans and more about ensuring their unity in the exploitation of Africa. It was a pact among powers to divide without fighting each other, to plunder without restraint. If you walk through Berlin today, the building on Wilhelmstrasse still stands. Passers-by may not know that within those walls, maps were drawn that would scar Africa for generations. The candlelight is gone, the cigar smoke long vanished, but the consequences linger. In the cities and villages of Africa, in the vaults of European banks, and in the collective memory of both continents. Some documents from that time remain locked away in European archives. What other bargains were struck? Which African leaders were betrayed by allies they thought they could trust? And how much of the wealth extracted then still fuels fortunes today? The Berlin Conference may be history, but its shadows stretch into the present. This was just one chapter in the story of Africa's encounter with European imperial ambition. There are countless others, hidden battles, forgotten resistances, and suppressed voices waiting to be told. If you want to uncover more of these untold histories, the ones left out of textbooks and hidden from the tourist brochures, join us here on History Off the Map. Because the past is never truly past, and some maps still lie.